When the college kids pulled up to Bob's auto repair, they were already laughing. "Look at this old guy," Tyler said. "Probably never seen a computer in his life." They had no idea they were looking at the man who'd programmed the navigation systems for 3 Space Shuttle missions. But Bob just smiled, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and asked, "What seems to be the problem?" Welcome to Untold Legends, where ordinary people carry extraordinary secrets. Today's story takes us to Cedar Falls, Montana, where sometimes the most brilliant minds hide in the most unexpected places. The red Tesla Model S pulled into Bob's auto repair with the kind of aggressive confidence that screamed money and entitlement. The driver, Tyler Mitchell, was 20 years old with perfectly styled hair and clothes that cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month. He was an MIT sophomore, home for spring break, and everything about his demeanor suggested he believed the world existed to serve him. "This place looks like it hasn't been updated since the 1980s, Brandon Cole muttered from the passenger seat. Stanford Jr., computer science major, and Tyler's best friend since prep school. He surveyed the modest garage with obvious disdain. In the back seat, Ashley Thompson rolled her eyes at her companions. 19 years old, Caltech engineering student, and considerably smarter than either of the boys, though they'd never admit it. "Maybe we should try the dealership in Billings instead," she suggested. "No way," Tyler said, stepping out of the Tesla. "I want to see if this old-timer can even figure out what's wrong. It'll be hilarious." The Tesla's charging system had been acting up for the past week. It would charge normally for a few minutes, then suddenly stop, displaying error codes that had stumped even the technicians at the Tesla Service Center in Denver. Tyler's father had connections there, but even they couldn't diagnose the problem remotely. Bob Harrison looked up from the engine compartment of a 2015 Ford F-150 as the 3 college students approached. At 58, he had the weathered hands and patient eyes of someone who'd spent decades solving complex problems. His gray hair was thinning, and his blue coveralls were stained with 15 years' worth of honest work. To anyone looking, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a small-town mechanic who'd been fixing cars his entire life. "Afternoon," Bob said, setting down his wrench and walking toward them. "You folks having car trouble?" Tyler smirked. "Yeah, if you think you can handle it. This is a Tesla Model S, not some pickup truck. It's got more computer power than anything you've probably ever seen." Bob nodded thoughtfully, seemingly unaware of the condescension in Tyler's voice. "Tesla, huh? Nice vehicles. What's the problem?" "Charging system malfunction," Brandon said, pulling out his iPhone to film what he clearly expected to be an amusing interaction. "Error codes 15A7 and 22B9. I doubt you've even heard of diagnostic ports on electric vehicles." Ashley shot Brandon a warning look, but he was already recording. "Well," Bob said mildly, "let's take a look and see what we can figure out." As they walked toward the Tesla, Tyler continued his commentary. "My dad bought this car for $120,000. That's probably more than this whole garage is worth. The onboard computer has more processing power than the computers that put men on the moon." Bob paused for just a moment, something flickering behind his eyes. "Is that right?" he said quietly. "Oh yeah," Tyler continued, warming to his subject. 16 core processors, quantum encryption, satellite GPS with real-time traffic analysis. I bet you've never seen anything this advanced." Bob opened the Tesla's hood, revealing the electric motor and battery management system. His movements were careful and methodical as he examined the components. Tyler and Brandon exchanged amused glances, clearly expecting him to be overwhelmed by the technology. Interesting, Bob murmured, looking at the charging port. Mind if I connect to the diagnostic interface? Tyler laughed. You have a diagnostic interface for a Tesla in this place? Bob walked to his workbench and returned with what appeared to be a standard OBD scanner, but Ashley noticed immediately that it had been heavily modified. Custom circuit boards, additional ports, and modifications that suggested someone with serious electronics knowledge had been working on it. Built it myself, Bob said simply, connecting the device to the Tesla's diagnostic port. Sometimes the standard tools don't give you the whole picture. The scanner's display lit up with data that made Ashley's engineering student brain immediately pay attention. The information being displayed was far more detailed than anything she'd seen from commercial diagnostic tools. Huh, Bob said, studying the readouts. Looks like you've got a cascading thermal management issue. The battery cooling system is detecting phantom temperature spikes that aren't actually happening, so it's shutting down the charging process as a safety measure. Tyler's smirk faltered slightly. What? Your thermal sensors are giving false readings to the main computer, Bob explained patiently. Probably a firmware issue interacting with a hardware calibration problem. The sensors think the batteries are overheating when they're not, so the charging system shuts down to prevent damage. Brandon lowered his phone, suddenly interested despite himself. How can you tell all that? Bob pointed to specific data streams on his scanner. See these voltage fluctuations here? And this temperature variance pattern? When you cross-reference them with the error logs, it creates a signature that points to sensor miscalibration. Ashley stepped closer, her Caltech training kicking in. That's actually a really sophisticated diagnosis. How did you learn about Tesla's thermal management protocols? For the first time, Bob hesitated. Oh, you pick things up over the years. Electric vehicles aren't that different from anything else once you understand the principles. But Ashley was looking more closely at Bob's diagnostic tool. The modifications weren't amateur work. The circuit integration was professional grade, and some of the components looked like they came from aerospace applications. This is custom silicon, she said, pointing to one of the chips. Where did you get this? Bob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Salvaged from old equipment. You'd be surprised what people throw away. Tyler, feeling left out of the technical discussion, jumped back in with renewed arrogance. Okay, so you figured out what's wrong. Can you actually fix it? Or do we need to take it to someone who knows what they're doing? I think I can help, Bob said. But it's going to require updating the firmware and recalibrating the sensor array. Might take a couple hours. Hours? Brandon protested. We have a party to get to tonight. Complex problems take time to solve properly, Bob replied. But if you're in a hurry, there's a decent restaurant about 2 blocks down. Mary's Diner. Tell her Bob sent you, and she'll take good care of you. As the 3 students walked away, still grumbling about the delay, Bob returned to the Tesla with a focus that would have surprised them. His movements were suddenly more precise, more purposeful. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was an engineer solving a complex system integration problem. And in the back of his mind, memories that he'd tried to bury for 15 years began to surface. Bob's Auto Repair sat at the edge of Cedar Falls, Montana, in a building that had housed various businesses for the better part of 50 years. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be. A small-town garage where locals brought their pickups and sedans for honest work at fair prices. The inside told a different story for anyone who knew how to look. Bob's tool collection was extensive and immaculately organized, But hidden among the standard automotive equipment were precision instruments that belonged in research laboratories. Digital calipers accurate to thousandths of an inch, oscilloscopes for analyzing electrical signals, a computer workstation that, while not flashy, was running software that most universities couldn't afford, and in a locked cabinet behind the parts counter, carefully hidden beneath service manuals and inventory sheets, were documents that told the real story of Robert Harrison's life. NASA Employee Identification Badge, expired 15 years ago. Commendation letters from 3 different space missions. Patent documents for guidance system innovations that were still classified. And at the bottom of the stack, a resignation letter that had never been officially submitted. Bob had come to Cedar Falls in 2009, buying the struggling garage from old Pete Mueller, who was ready to retire but couldn't find a buyer. The town of 2,800 people had welcomed him without asking too many questions. He paid cash, worked hard, and kept to himself. In a community where minding your own business was considered a virtue, that was enough. What the residents of Cedar Falls didn't know was that Bob Harrison had once been Dr. Robert Harrison, senior aerospace engineer at NASA's Johnson Space Center. For 18 years, he had been part of the team that made space exploration possible. His specialty was guidance systems, the complex computer programs and hardware that told spacecraft where they were going, and how to get there safely. He had worked on the Space Shuttle program during its final years. His navigation algorithms had guided the International Space Station supply missions. His thermal management systems had kept astronauts alive. He had worked on the Space Shuttle program during its final years. His navigation algorithms had guided the International Space Station supply missions. His thermal management systems had kept astronauts alive in the hostile environment of space. He held patents on technologies that were still being used in spacecraft around the world. But in 2009, everything had changed. The Obama administration had announced the cancellation of the Constellation program, NASA's ambitious plan to return humans to the moon. Budget cuts were slashing programs across the space agency. Engineers who had devoted their careers to exploration were being laid off or reassigned to projects that felt more like bureaucratic exercises than scientific advancement. Bob had watched colleagues with decades of experience being forced into early retirement. He had sat through meetings where politicians who had never been closer to space than an airplane window made decisions about technologies they didn't understand. The passion that had driven him through graduate school and 18 years of 12-hour days had slowly died under the weight of budget spreadsheets and political maneuvering. The final straw had come during a mission review meeting for what would become one of the last shuttle flights. Bob had identified a potential problem with the thermal protection system, a small issue that could become catastrophic under the wrong conditions. His concerns were dismissed by administrators who were more worried about schedule delays than safety margins. The shuttle launched on time. Bob's predicted problem never manifested, but the willingness of management to ignore engineering concerns for political reasons had broken something fundamental in his faith in the system. So Dr. Robert Harrison had quietly cleaned out his office, loaded his pickup truck, and driven west until he found a place where nobody knew who he was or what he had done. Cedar Falls, Montana, had seemed like the perfect place to disappear. For 15 years, he had found peace in the simple satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. Cars were less complex than spacecraft, but the fundamental principles were the same. Identify the problem, understand the system, implement the solution. No committees, no budget reviews, no political considerations. Just engineering in its purest form. The people of Cedar Falls respected his skill without asking questions about where he had learned it. When Sheriff Frank Reynolds needed help with the computer system in his patrol car, Bob fixed it without explaining that he had once programmed navigation computers for missions to the International Space Station. When the high school physics teacher struggled to explain orbital mechanics to her students, Bob quietly donated some old textbooks without mentioning that he had helped write the procedures being used by actual astronauts. It was a good life. Quiet, honest, and free from the frustrations that had driven him away from NASA. He had told himself that he was content. But as Bob worked on Tyler's Tesla, using diagnostic techniques that drew on his deep understanding of complex systems, he couldn't ignore the feeling that had been growing stronger over the past few years. The world of space exploration was advancing rapidly, with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin achieving things that NASA had only dreamed of during his tenure. New missions to Mars were being planned. Commercial space travel was becoming reality. And Dr. Robert Harrison, one of the engineers who had helped make it all possible, was changing oil in pickup trucks. The thought didn't make him bitter, exactly. But it did make him wonder, sometimes, what he might have accomplished if he had stayed. What problems he might have solved, what innovations he might have contributed to humanity's greatest adventure. As he recalibrated the Tesla's thermal sensors using techniques he had originally developed for spacecraft operating in the vacuum of space, Bob allowed himself to remember what it felt like to work on projects that pushed the boundaries of human capability. He had no idea that within hours, the past he had tried so hard to leave behind would come looking for him. Bob worked on the Tesla with a focus that bordered on meditation. The charging system malfunction was more complex than he had initially indicated to the college students, but it was exactly the kind of systems integration challenge that he had spent 18 years mastering at NASA. The problem wasn't just thermal sensor miscalibration, though that was part of it. The real issue was a cascade failure in the battery management system's communication protocols. The sensors were giving false readings because of electromagnetic interference from a poorly shielded power converter, which was causing the main computer to misinterpret normal operational data as critical warnings. In spacecraft, this kind of problem could be catastrophic. A single sensor giving bad data could cause a mission-critical system to shut down at exactly the wrong moment. Bob had learned to trace these cascading failures through multiple system layers, following the chain of cause and effect until he found the root problem. The Tesla's computer architecture was actually quite similar to the guidance systems he had worked on for the space station supply missions. Multiple redundant processors cross-checking each other's data, sophisticated error-checking algorithms, and safety protocols designed to shut down systems at the first sign of trouble. The principles were the same, even if the application was different. Bob connected his modified diagnostic tool to several different access points in the Tesla system, building a comprehensive picture of the vehicle's operational status. His tool was considerably more sophisticated than anything available commercially, because he had built it using techniques learned from designing diagnostic systems for spacecraft. When you're troubleshooting a problem on the International Space Station, you can't just replace parts and see what happens. Every component is precisely engineered, thoroughly tested, and incredibly expensive. You have to understand exactly what's wrong before you can fix it. Bob had learned to diagnose complex system failures using only data analysis and logical deduction. As he traced the electromagnetic interference to its source, Bob found himself falling back into the methodical, systematic thinking that had made him one of NASA's most effective engineers. Every measurement was precise. Every hypothesis was tested against multiple data points. Every conclusion was verified through independent methods. It felt good to use his mind this way again. The solution, when he found it, was elegant in its simplicity. A single component needed to be repositioned to eliminate the electromagnetic interference. The thermal sensors needed to be recalibrated to account for normal operational variations. And the charging algorithm needed a minor firmware update to make it less sensitive to transient signals. Bob completed the work in just under 2 hours, including the time needed to verify that the fix had actually solved the problem. When he reconnected the charging cable, the Tesla's systems ran through their diagnostic sequence and settled into normal operation. No error codes, no sudden shutdowns, no warning messages. But as he was finishing the paperwork, Bob became aware of unusual activity outside his garage. 2 black SUVs had pulled into the parking lot, their occupants remaining inside but clearly watching the building. The vehicles had government license plates and the kind of low-profile communications antennas that suggested federal agencies. Bob's blood ran cold. After 15 years of anonymity, had someone finally connected Dr. Robert Harrison with Bob the small-town mechanic? Through the garage's front window, he could see the college students walking back from the diner, still engaged in animated conversation. They seemed oblivious to the surveillance vehicles, but Bob's trained eye picked up other details. A third vehicle parked across the street. 2 people in business attire sitting on a bench near the town square, both facing the garage despite the bench facing the opposite direction. Bob forced himself to remain calm and continue working. If this was what he thought it was, panicking would only make things worse. Whatever had brought federal attention to his garage, the best thing he could do was act normally and hope it would pass. The college students returned to find Bob putting the finishing touches on their repair. "All done," he announced, handing Tyler the keys. "Your charging system should work normally now. The problem was electromagnetic interference causing sensor miscalibration." Tyler looked skeptical. "That's it? You fixed a Tesla with the same tools you use on pickup trucks?" "Physics is physics," Bob replied. "The principles don't change just because the application is different." Ashley was studying the bill Bob had handed them. $85? That's all? For 2 hours of diagnostic work and a firmware update? "Fair price for fair work," Bob said. "No point in overcharging for something that doesn't take expensive parts." Brandon shook his head. "Man, you have no idea what this would have cost us at a Tesla service center. They wanted to replace the entire charging system for $3,000. "Sometimes the simple solution is the right solution," Bob observed. As the students prepared to leave, Ashley lingered behind. "That diagnostic tool you built," she said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it. Where did you learn to design custom electronics like that?" Bob met her eyes steadily. "YouTube University," he said with a slight smile. "Amazing what you can learn these days if you're motivated." Ashley didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, thank you. You probably saved us a lot of money and hassle." After the Tesla pulled away, Bob began closing up the garage for the day. But he was acutely aware of the continued surveillance presence outside. Whatever was about to happen, he suspected his quiet life in Cedar Falls was about to become very complicated. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone rang. The number on the display was one he hadn't seen in 15 years, but he recognized it immediately. NASA Johnson Space Center. Bob stared at the phone for several rings before finally answering. "Bob's Auto Repair," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Dr. Harrison?" came a familiar voice. "This is Dr. Sarah Williams, Director of Mission Operations at Johnson Space Center. I think we need to talk." Dr. Sarah Williams had been a junior engineer when Bob left NASA 15 years ago. Now she was running mission operations for the agency's most ambitious projects in decades. Her voice carried the weight of authority, but Bob could hear the underlying tension that came with serious problems and inadequate solutions. "Dr. Williams," Bob said carefully. "It's been a long time." 15 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Sarah replied. Not that anyone was counting. "Bob, we have a situation, and frankly, you're the only person we know who might be able to help." Through the garage window, Bob could see that the surveillance teams were making no effort to hide their presence anymore. This wasn't a coincidence or a routine investigation. This was a recruitment operation. "I'm not Dr. Harrison anymore," Bob said. "I'm just a mechanic in Montana. I think you have the wrong number." "Bob, please listen to me." Sarah's voice took on an urgent tone. "We have a crew of 6 astronauts on the International Space Station who may die if we can't solve a guidance system failure that's got our best engineers completely stumped. The backup systems are failing one by one, and we're running out of time." Bob felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "What kind of guidance system failure?" "Cascading computational errors in the navigation array. The station's computer thinks it's in a decaying orbit when it's actually stable. It keeps firing thrusters to correct for orbital mechanics that aren't happening, which is actually destabilizing the orbit and wasting fuel. We've got maybe 72 hours before the situation becomes irreversible." Bob sat down heavily on his work stool. This was exactly the kind of problem that had driven him away from NASA in the first place. Complex system failures that required someone to think outside the established protocols. "Have you tried isolating the navigation computer and running diagnostics on the sensor array?" he asked, his engineering instincts overriding his desire to remain uninvolved. "First thing we tried. All sensors are reading normally. The problem seems to be in how the computer is interpreting the data it's receiving. It's like the software is stuck in a feedback loop that's getting worse instead of better." Bob closed his eyes, his mind automatically beginning to analyze the problem. Feedback loops in guidance systems were something he had dealt with extensively during his NASA years. They usually resulted from the computer misinterpreting sensor data and making corrections that actually made the original problem worse. "What about the thermal environment data?" he asked. "Sometimes the computer interprets thermal expansion in the station structure as positional changes." "We checked that too. Thermal readings are all normal." "Bob, I know this is asking a lot, but we need someone who understands both the hardware and software systems at a fundamental level. You wrote half the original code that these systems are based on." Bob opened his eyes and saw Ashley Thompson standing outside his garage, apparently having returned without her friends. She was studying the surveillance vehicles with the analytical expression of someone trained to notice details that others missed. "Sarah, I've been out of the game for 15 years. Technology has moved on. I probably don't even understand the current systems." "The core principles haven't changed," Sarah replied. "And frankly, some of the original designs you worked on were more robust than what we're using now. We simplified things for cost reasons that may have introduced vulnerabilities." Bob watched Ashley approach the garage entrance. Her posture suggested someone who had figured out that something significant was happening and was curious enough to investigate. "Even if I wanted to help," Bob said, "I couldn't get security clearance fast enough to be useful. Background investigations take months." "Actually," Sarah's voice took on a note of mild embarrassment, "you still have clearance. We never officially processed your resignation. Technically, you've been on extended leave without pay for 15 years. Bob nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "Your supervisor at the time, Frank Chen, refused to accept your resignation letter. said you were too valuable to lose and that you'd come back when you were ready. He kept renewing your clearance every year until he retired, and then I took over the responsibility. We've been hoping you'd come home eventually." Bob looked at his reflection in the garage's window. Weathered hands, graying hair, clothes that smelled like motor oil and honest work. Dr. Robert Harrison felt like someone he had known in another lifetime. "Where are you calling from?" he asked. "Johnson Space Center. But we have a transport team standing by to bring you to Houston if you agree to help." "Bob, I won't lie to you. This is a long shot. We've had our best people working on this for 36 hours, and we're not any closer to a solution. But you see problems differently than anyone else I've ever worked with." Ashley had reached the garage entrance and was making gestures suggesting she wanted to talk. Bob waved her inside while continuing his conversation. "How do you know I'm still capable of this kind of work?" Bob asked. "For all you know, I've spent 15 years replacing spark plugs and haven't thought about orbital mechanics since I left Houston." "Because," Sarah said, 3 hours ago, our monitoring systems detected an electromagnetic signature from Cedar Falls, Montana, that matches the diagnostic protocols you developed for the shuttle thermal protection system. When we investigated, we found that someone had used those protocols to repair a Tesla charging system. The only person outside NASA who knows those techniques is you." Bob looked at Ashley, who was listening to his half of the conversation with undisguised fascination. The young woman's presence suddenly made sense. She wasn't just a curious college student. She was smart enough to have recognized that Bob's repair techniques were far more sophisticated than any normal mechanic would possess. "Dr. Williams," Bob said finally, "I'm going to need a few minutes to think about this." "Of course. But Bob, please don't take too long. Those astronauts are counting on us to solve this problem, and you may be their best hope." After ending the call, Bob turned to Ashley, who was studying his garage with new understanding. "You're not really just a mechanic, are you?" she said. Bob sighed. "What gave it away?" "The diagnostic tool you built uses aerospace-grade components. The repair techniques you used on Tyler's car are based on spacecraft thermal management principles. And," she gestured toward the surveillance vehicles, "mechanics don't usually have federal agents watching their every move." Bob looked at this 19-year-old engineering student who had seen through his carefully constructed cover in less than 4 hours. "What do you think I should do?" Ashley considered the question seriously. "If NASA is asking for your help with a life-or-death situation, and you're the only person who might be able to solve it, then I think you already know what you need to do." Bob nodded slowly. She was right, of course. He had spent 15 years running from his responsibilities, but some obligations transcended personal comfort. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah Williams back. "Dr. Williams? This is Bob Harrison. When do you need me in Houston?" The flight from Billings to Houston took 4 hours, but for Bob, it felt like traveling through time itself. The NASA transport jet was equipped with secure communications equipment that allowed him to receive briefings during the flight, and with each technical document he reviewed, Dr. Robert Harrison gradually emerged from the 15-year hibernation of Bob the mechanic. The International Space Station guidance system failure was even more complex than Sarah Williams had indicated on the phone. The station's main navigation computer was reporting positional data that contradicted information from backup systems, ground-based tracking, and even GPS satellites. More troubling, the computer was making automatic corrections based on its faulty data, gradually destabilizing the station's orbit. 3 separate teams of engineers had spent the past 48 hours trying to identify the source of the problem. They had tested every sensor, analyzed every line of code, and run thousands of diagnostic simulations. Nothing they tried had any effect on the cascading failure that was slowly pushing the International Space Station toward an uncontrolled re-entry. Bob reviewed the technical data with the systematic approach he had developed over 18 years of solving impossible problems. The symptoms suggested a fundamental error in how the computer was interpreting sensory data. But the specific nature of the error was unlike anything he had seen before. As the plane descended toward Houston, Bob felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that had always accompanied his most challenging projects. This was what he had missed during his exile in Montana, the intellectual satisfaction of working on problems that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. Johnson Space Center looked exactly as Bob remembered it, despite 15 years of technological advancement. The same sprawling complex of buildings housing humanity's most ambitious dreams. The same sense of focused intensity that came from thousands of people working toward common goals that seemed almost impossible. Sarah Williams met him at the security checkpoint, and Bob was struck by how much she had changed in 15 years. The uncertain junior engineer, he remembered, had become a confident leader with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives and billions of dollars in equipment. "Bob," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. I know this wasn't an easy decision." "Neither was leaving," Bob replied. "But that's ancient history now. What's the current status of the situation?" As they walked toward Mission Control, Sarah briefed him on the latest developments. "We've managed to stabilize the station's attitude using manual thruster controls, but we can't maintain that indefinitely. The crew is having to make constant adjustments to counteract what the computer thinks are orbital decay corrections." They passed through corridors that Bob remembered walking thousands of times during his NASA career. The walls were lined with photographs from decades of missions, shuttle launches, space station construction, Mars rover landings, images that represented humanity's greatest achievements in exploration and discovery. Mission Control was exactly as Bob remembered it, though the computer displays were larger and the workstations more sophisticated. Dozens of engineers and flight controllers were monitoring every aspect of the space station's operations, their faces showing the strain of dealing with a crisis that had no obvious solution. Bob was introduced to the core team that had been working on the guidance system failure. Each engineer was exceptional in their field, with advanced degrees from the best universities and years of experience with space systems. Under normal circumstances, they would be more than capable of solving any technical problem that arose. But this problem wasn't normal. "Show me the data," Bob said, settling into a workstation that had been prepared for his use. For the next hour, Bob immersed himself in the technical details of the system failure. He reviewed sensor logs, analyzed computer code, and studied orbital mechanics calculations that would have challenged most physicists. Gradually, he began to see patterns that the other engineers had missed. The problem wasn't with any single component or software module. Instead, it appeared to be an emergent behavior arising from the interaction between multiple systems that had been designed independently. The navigation computer was correctly processing data from individual sensors, but when it attempted to integrate information from multiple sources, tiny timing discrepancies were creating computational errors that grew exponentially over time. "It's a synchronization problem," Bob announced to the assembled team. "The computer is trying to reconcile data from sensors that are operating on slightly different timing cycles. The differences are measured in microseconds, but they accumulate over time into significant errors." Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the lead software engineer on the project, frowned. "We checked the timing protocols. All sensors are synchronized to the master clock." They're synchronized when the system starts up, Bob corrected. But they drift apart over time due to temperature variations, electromagnetic interference, and normal component aging. The original system design included compensation algorithms for this drift, but they've been disabled. Disabled? Sarah Williams asked. Why would they be disabled? Bob pulled up the configuration files for the navigation system. Budget cuts. The compensation algorithms required additional processing power and memory, which cost money. Someone decided they were unnecessary and removed them to reduce system complexity. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A cost-saving measure implemented years ago had gradually degraded the station's guidance systems until they reached a critical failure point. Can we re-enable the compensation algorithms? Asked Dr. Martinez. Not remotely, Bob replied. The code was completely removed from the system. We'd have to rewrite it from scratch and upload new software to the station. How long would that take? Sarah asked. Bob considered the question carefully. With the current team, probably 6 to 8 weeks. We'd have to recreate algorithms that took months to develop originally, then test them thoroughly to make sure they don't introduce new problems. We don't have 6 weeks, Sarah said grimly. We've got maybe 18 hours before the orbital decay becomes irreversible. Bob stared at the displays showing the space station's current position and trajectory. 6 human beings were depending on the people in this room to solve an impossible problem with an impossible deadline. Then he remembered something from his files in Montana. Actually, Bob said slowly, we might not have to rewrite everything from scratch. I may have a copy of the original compensation algorithms. Where? Sarah asked. Bob almost smiled. In my garage in Montana. I kept backup copies of all my work when I left NASA. Old habits from a paranoid engineer. Within an hour, Ashley Thompson was standing in Bob's auto repair with a secure satellite phone, reading code from 15-year-old backup files to engineers at Johnson Space Center. The young woman who had figured out Bob's secret was now playing a crucial role in saving the lives of 6 astronauts. It would take another 12 hours to adapt the old algorithms to the current systems, test them thoroughly, and upload them to the space station. But for the first time in 72 hours, the engineers at NASA had a realistic plan for solving the crisis. As Bob worked through the night alongside some of the most brilliant minds in aerospace engineering, he realized that his 15 years in exile hadn't been wasted time. They had given him perspective, patience, and a different way of looking at complex problems. Dr. Robert Harrison was back, but he was also forever changed by his time as Bob the mechanic. At 3:47 a.m. Houston time, the modified guidance algorithms were successfully uploaded to the International Space Station. Bob watched the telemetry displays with the focused intensity he remembered from his shuttle mission days, looking for any sign that the cascading system failure was finally under control. For the first hour, nothing seemed to change. The station's computer continued making the same erratic corrections, and the orbital mechanics remained unstable. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the computational errors began to decrease. The synchronization problems that had been building for months were finally being corrected by algorithms that accounted for the tiny timing discrepancies between sensors. "It's working, Doctor," Martinez announced quietly. "Navigation errors are decreasing across all systems." A cheer went up from the mission control team, but Bob remained focused on the data streams. Experience had taught him that complex system failures could have multiple causes, and solving one problem sometimes revealed others that had been hidden. "Orbital mechanics are stabilizing," reported the flight dynamics officer. Station is maintaining proper attitude without manual corrections. Bob watched for another hour as the space station's systems gradually returned to normal operation. The crew, who had been manually controlling the station's position for nearly 4 days, were finally able to return to their scientific research and routine maintenance tasks. As the immediate crisis passed, Bob became aware of the small crowd that had gathered around his workstation. Engineers, flight controllers, and NASA administrators were looking at him with expressions of gratitude, respect, and something approaching awe. "Dr. Harrison," Sarah Williams said, "on behalf of NASA and the crew of the International Space Station, thank you. You saved 6 lives tonight." Bob nodded, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from solving a problem that had seemed impossible just hours before. This was what he had missed during his years in Montana, the knowledge that his work mattered on a scale that extended far beyond individual satisfaction. But as the congratulations continued, Bob found himself thinking about Cedar Falls, Montana, about the simple pleasure of fixing things that were broken, about a community that had accepted him without asking questions about his past or demanding explanations for his knowledge. "What happens now?" asked Dr. Martinez. "Will you be staying to help with the post-incident analysis?" Bob considered the question. There would certainly be months of work involved in understanding how the guidance system failure had developed and ensuring it never happened again. NASA would undoubtedly offer him a senior position with a salary that reflected his unique expertise. He could return to the cutting edge of space exploration, working on projects that pushed the boundaries of human capability. But he was no longer the same person who had left NASA 15 years ago. His time as Bob the mechanic had taught him that satisfaction didn't always come from working on the most advanced technology or the most ambitious projects. Sometimes it came from helping college students fix their cars, or maintaining the patrol vehicles that kept a small community safe. "I need to think about it," Bob said finally. "This has been a lot to process." Sarah Williams nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Bob, I hope you know that you'll always have a home here at NASA. What you did tonight proves that you're still one of the best engineers we've ever had." As the celebration continued around him, Bob's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ashley Thompson, who was still in his garage in Montana. "Tyler and Brandon are here. They want to apologize for being jerks yesterday. Also, Sheriff Reynolds needs help with his patrol car computer again. When are you coming home?" Bob smiled at the message. Home. When had he started thinking of Cedar Falls as home? 3 days later, Bob returned to Montana to find his garage exactly as he had left it, except for a small handwritten sign that Ashley had posted on the front door. "Gone to save the space station. Back soon. Bob." Tyler Mitchell and Brandon Cole were waiting for him, both looking considerably more humble than they had during their previous visit. "Mr. Harrison," Tyler began awkwardly, "we owe you an apology. We were rude and disrespectful, and we're sorry." "We had no idea who you were," Brandon added. "If we had known you were a NASA engineer." Bob held up a hand to stop them. "You shouldn't need to know someone's credentials to treat them with respect. Every person you meet knows something you don't. Every job requires skills and knowledge that deserve recognition." Ashley emerged from the garage, where she had apparently been organizing his tools. "I've been telling them the same thing for 3 days," she said. "Maybe they'll listen to you." Over the following weeks, Bob found himself at the center of a minor media storm. News outlets around the world picked up the story of the small-town mechanic who had saved the International Space Station. Interview requests poured in from television programs, magazines, and documentary filmmakers. Bob declined almost all of them, He had spent 15 years learning to value privacy and anonymity, and he wasn't eager to give them up for fame. But he did agree to one interview with the Cedar Falls High School newspaper. The student journalist, a 17-year-old named Emma Rodriguez, asked him questions that were more thoughtful than anything he heard from the national media. "Do you regret leaving NASA?" she asked during their conversation in the garage. Bob considered the question while cleaning a carburetor from a 1987 pickup truck. "I regret the circumstances that made me feel like I had to leave," he said finally. "But I don't regret the experiences I've had since then. Living in Cedar Falls has taught me things about life and community that I never would have learned in Houston." "Will you go back to NASA now?" "NASA has offered me several positions," Bob replied, "but I think my most important work might be right here." 3 months later, Bob opened the Cedar Falls Center for Applied Engineering in the expanded space next to his garage. The center offered courses in automotive repair, electronics, computer programming, and basic aerospace engineering. Students ranged from high school kids like Emma Rodriguez to retirees like Pete Johnson, who had always been curious about how things worked. Ashley Thompson spent her summer internship helping Bob design the curriculum, bringing the rigor of her Caltech education to practical problems that students could see and touch. Tyler Mitchell and Brandon Cole, whose attitudes had been permanently adjusted by their encounter with Bob, volunteered as teaching assistants when they were home from college. The center became something unique, a place where theoretical knowledge met practical application, where students learned that intelligence came in many forms and that respect was earned through character rather than credentials. Bob continued to operate his auto repair business, but he also consulted with NASA on guidance system design and served as an unofficial mentor to young engineers who were struggling with the same frustrations that had once driven him away from the space program. On quiet evenings, when the garage was closed and the center was empty, Bob would sometimes stand outside and look up at the night sky. He could often spot the International Space Station passing overhead, a bright point of light that represented humanity's greatest adventure. 5 years after the International Space Station crisis, Bob Harrison received a package that made him laugh out loud. It was from Tyler Mitchell, who had graduated from MIT and was now working as a software engineer for SpaceX. Inside the package was a framed photograph of the company's latest rocket launch, with a note written in Tyler's careful handwriting. "Dr. Harrison, this rocket uses guidance algorithms based on principles you taught me in your garage. Thanks for showing me that wisdom doesn't always come with credentials, and that the best teachers are often the ones you least expect. Tyler." Bob hung the photograph in the Cedar Falls Center for Applied Engineering, next to dozens of similar mementos from students who had gone on to careers in engineering, science, and technology. Each one represented a young person who had learned that knowledge came in many forms and that respect was earned through character rather than credentials. The center had become something of a pilgrimage site for educators who wanted to understand how to combine theoretical learning with practical application. Bob regularly hosted visits from university professors, NASA engineers, and representatives from technology companies who were trying to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and real-world problem-solving. But his favorite visitors were always the local students who came to learn how to fix their cars, build computers, or understand the physics behind the technology they used every day. These young people reminded him of why he had fallen in love with engineering in the first place, the pure joy of figuring out how things worked and making them work better. Ashley Thompson had graduated from Caltech and was now working on her PhD in aerospace engineering at Stanford. She spent her summers in Cedar Falls, helping Bob expand the center's offerings and developing new ways to make complex engineering concepts accessible to students without advanced mathematics backgrounds. You know, she told Bob during one of these summer visits, I learned more about real engineering in your garage than I did in 2 years of college classes. Bob smiled as he watched a group of high school students working on a solar panel installation project. College teaches you the theory, he said, but you don't really understand engineering until you've had to solve problems with limited resources, uncertain data, and real consequences for failure. The Cedar Falls Center for Applied Engineering had become proof that extraordinary things could happen in ordinary places when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the hidden potential in everyone they met. Bob Harrison, Dr. Robert Harrison, NASA engineer, small-town mechanic, and teacher, had found something more valuable than fame or recognition. He had found a way to use his gifts in service of his community, bridging the gap between the highest levels of human achievement and the daily challenges faced by ordinary people. And every night, when he looked up at the stars, he knew that both kinds of work were part of the same human story, the endless quest to understand our universe and our place in it, one solved problem at a time. This has been an Untold Legends story. Subscribe for more tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.